This Jewish faithfulness was rewarded after a few decades of captivity when Cyrus, the Persian ruler who had conquered Babylonia, permitted them to return to Jerusalem. Those who returned rebuilt the temple.
When the survivors of the exile in Babylonia were allowed to come back and rebuild near the end of the 6th century BCE, they built what we now call the Second Temple. And that temple survived all the way down into the Roman period.
The repatriates canonized the official version of the Pentateuch, the first 5 of the sacred books that would constitute the Hebrew Bible. From the period of the First Temple through the Babylonian exile and then into the early years of the Second Temple, Israel was gifted with a series of prophets. The utterances of 15 of these prophets were gathered with some historical writings to produce a second collection of Jewish scripture, which was added to the Pentateuch. Eventually, there was a third section, known as the Hagiographa, which was a collection of additional literary and historical writings. The 3 parts together constituted the Bible of the Jews, and it would prove to be one of the most influential documents in world civilization. The Second Temple was rebuilt around 520 BCE. It would remain standing for some 6 centuries. For most of this period, the Jews did not enjoy full sovereignty.
And so they lived from 516 before the Common Era until the destruction of the Second Temple in 70 of the Common Era in that land, though never or rarely in total freedom, because one empire after another conquered that area. It was almost a crossroads of civilization.
They were ruled for several centuries by Persians, then by Greeks and Syrians. But in the 2nd and 1st centuries BCE, there was a glorious period of independence under the Hasmonean rulers, also known as the Maccabees.
The Maccabees come into the picture about 165, and it was after the area of Palestine had come under Syrian Hellenistic control. And they tried to introduce Hellenistic ideas into Judea. Judea at that point was on the border between them and their rival Egypt, and they wanted to ensure that Judah was well established in their kingdom and well built into their security system. So they introduced a lot of changes, put their own families into power, tried to introduce their own religious ideas and so forth in order to assimilate the province into the rest of their empire. And that created the first backlash, which eventually resulted in the revolt of the Maccabees.
This was to be the last period of full freedom for the Jews for over 2,000 years. It ended when the Romans conquered Judea in 63 BCE. The last century of this Second Temple period was marked by intensive unrest among the Jews, which was coupled with hope for the arrival of a Messiah who would restore the glory of the Jewish people. Judaism's greatest crisis came in the year 70 CE. The Jews of Palestine rebelled against their Roman rulers. After 4 years of bitter warfare, including a lengthy siege of Jerusalem, the rebellion was crushed. Jerusalem and its temple were destroyed. This marked the final end of Jewish independence. The Romans deported masses of Jews from their land, beginning what Jews called their exile. It would last almost 19 centuries.
The Roman response to the rebellion that finally led to the destruction of the temple was devastating to the population in the land of Israel. And it really stopped being the center of Jewish life. The centers moved elsewhere, but Judea was devastated, it was depopulated, the temple was gone, so other areas had to kind of pick up the slack after that.
For example, the Jews who remained in Babylonia after the exile founded a Babylonian Jewish community that lasted for 20 centuries.
The Jews managed to maintain a sense of community in Sura and Pumbeditha in Babylon, in Alexandria in Egypt, in Rome, in Greece. There were Jewish communities that set themselves apart from the larger community so that they could live by their own laws and follow their own traditions.
Instead of being temple-centered, Judaism now became synagogue-centered. For centuries, Jews had endeavored to visit the Jerusalem temple as often as possible on one of the pilgrimage festivals, Passover, Pentecost, and Tabernacles. But this had become increasingly difficult as the Jewish diaspora extended. There was a need for a local outlet for communal worship, and out of this developed the synagogue. The synagogue was a revolutionary concept at a time when pagan temples were perceived to be the deity's physical place of residence, when worship was expressed through sacrifice, and shrines were accessible only to the priestly caste. Apart from the law dictated to Moses on Sinai, God had given Moses further oral instructions. These were handed down by word of mouth from generation to generation, and they were continually expanded, so that by the 1st century CE, this oral tradition had reached enormous proportions.
Well, the first piece of rabbinic literature we have, the earliest, is the Mishnah, was probably edited between 200 and 250 of the Common Era, and is the first attempt to explain how to use the Bible and the laws and the rules of the Bible in everyday life in the Roman world. The next important compilation was the Talmud. The Talmud was put in the form that we now have it probably around 550 or 600 of the Common Era, so about 400 years after the Mishnah. And it's a series of discussions, cases, precedents of how to interpret and how to apply Mishnah's understanding of biblical law to the new situations.
The Talmud is a massive work of some 3 million words. It is a complete library comprising a vast and detailed code covering the entire gamut of religious and civil life. Interspersed is lighter narrative material, including anecdotes and legends.
This doesn't seem to have any religious overtones. It's stuff of law school stuff. And what's it got to do with religion? But it does, because it means that people's relationships with others are not going to be based on the power that one person has or the other person lacks. Instead, they're going to be based on a principle of what is right and what is wrong, as enunciated in the rest of the Bible, all coming roughly under "thou shalt not steal. If it's not yours, leave it alone."
And it has been through the Torah, through the Talmud, and through our prayer book that the Jewish community, wherever they have managed to survive as a community.
By the early centuries CE, the Jewish dispersion had reached Arabia in the south, Armenia and Persia to the east, and the Atlantic Ocean to the west. Jews also followed in the wake of the Roman armies into northern Europe, where they established new communities. But the triumph of Christianity in the 4th century heralded tragedy for the Jews.
Well, with the rise of Christianity in about the 4th century, it did change the social and political situation of the Jews in what was left of the Roman Empire. As the Roman Empire collapsed, the church really became the one institutional structure that still survived, and it became the de facto government that replaced the Roman Empire.
The Byzantine emperors introduced anti-Jewish laws that were the foundation for centuries of terrible persecution. This legislation was meant to isolate and humiliate the Jews and to outlaw their close connection with Christian society. As the centuries passed, the Church made harsher and harsher laws against the Jews. Jews were marked out as pariahs, and they constantly were the victims of discrimination. Jews were forced to wear special clothing or special badges. They were subject to attacks, expulsions, and massacres. Under these circumstances, it was not surprising that Jews, confined to their own ghettos, became intensely introspective and immersed themselves in their own culture.